Hi, and welcome back to day 2 of our Reading Comprehension and Literacy Basics course. So, where were we? What are we doing today? And what's happening tomorrow? Yesterday, we had a look at why every teacher needs to know about the science of reading and learning, even if they're not teaching reading per se, and what is the science of reading and learning. And in particular, we looked at 2 really critical frameworks, Scarborough's reading rope and cognitive load theory. So today, we're going to use those 2 frameworks that we learnt about, and we're going to use them to have a look at some common teacher misconceptions that we might hold that might lead to some planning mistakes, making things more challenging for our students, and what should we maybe be doing instead. And tomorrow, we will take a look at an implementation model and how that might look like in your context. Okay, so let's recap the 2 theoretical frameworks that we looked at. One is based on the body of research in the science of reading, and that's Scarborough's reading rope. And we know that if we take a look at the rope, then it tells us all the elements that go into skilled reading. And there are 8 elements there, 5 in the language comprehension part and 3 in word recognition. We know that word recognition relates to how students literally read the words on the page and how they're able to actually look at the symbols, the letters, and make sense of those symbols. The language comprehension part is how students make sense of the meaning in the text, and that can be done orally or through reading. We also know that the most critical elements of language comprehension are background knowledge, vocabulary, and language structure, because verbal reasoning depends on those 3. The other framework that we looked at was cognitive load theory, and that tells us how memory works and what we can do to help students consolidate knowledge more efficiently. All right, so now that we understand those, we're going to start with Scarborough's reading rope, and in particular, we're going to look at background knowledge, because there are a lot of misconceptions that relate specifically to that element of the rope. Now, I'm reading Rage by Bryce Courtney. He's a brilliant writer, and I love his work. I love the novel. Sometimes I'm even having like a visceral response to the way that he describes things, and I'm learning a lot about South Africa. But I want to read you a section, and it's a bit blurry because I just took a quick photo. I thought it would be a good example. A section of the text. Sean Courtney is a character in the novel. So, Sean Courtney was the stalwart of the Western Province Preparatory School First 15, or Wet Pups, as the school was known. Quick and strong, he ran in 4 tries against the Rondebosch juniors and converted them himself, while his father and 2 younger brothers stood on the touchline and yelled encouragement. Okay, I like to think of myself as a well-educated, highly literate professional, and I just didn't understand this section. I read it and I thought, what is going on here? Whereas my husband, as I was preparing this, had a look at this and he said, look, that's obviously about rugby. So what's going on, and how can we use Scarborough's reading rope to understand why this tripped me up, but it didn't trip up my husband? So if we take a look again at Scarborough's reading rope, we know that the first element up here is background knowledge, and that is knowledge about facts, concepts, and things like that. So for me, I don't know anything about sport. My family wasn't a sporting family. I never went to any sporting games. I don't really have any understanding of sport. I have a little bit more than maybe when I was in primary school, but still it's quite limited for me. So when I read that section of text, I just couldn't comprehend what was happening there. But is that just something that happened for me? And what does the research tell us about how critical background knowledge is? So for that, we turn to a study completed in 1988. And researchers took a group of students that were considered to be very strong students in the top 20th percentile or so of readers, and weak readers who were in about the bottom 20th percentile of readers. Now, they gave them a reading about baseball. And what they found when they tested their comprehension is that weak readers who knew a lot about baseball read to the same level, with a few caveats, but it gets a little bit more complex, for our purposes, to the same level as the strong readers. That was really an important piece of research that has since been replicated, and the findings have been found to be true time and time again. What this is telling us is that reading is a function of knowledge, and the more that we know, the better we can read. So students and we, all of us, don't have necessarily one level of reading. Our level of reading depends on the topic we're reading and how much knowledge we have. So what does this mean for us? This means that reading is not a skill. It's not like learning to ride a bike, where if you learn how to ride one bike, you can ride any bike. Knowledge is very content specific. Reading is content specific, and it really depends on the amount of knowledge that a student has on a certain topic, but also critically on a certain idea. So when we look at reading in secondary schools, we're often trying to get students to think about things at the higher end of Bloom's. They might be thinking about the issue of survival in a novel, or they might be thinking about the impacts of machinery in the Industrial Revolution. That is the same thing. How much they know about the idea of survival, or how much they know about the background of how people can be impacted by machinery, will impact whether or not they can read and comprehend and understand the text or the video that we're asking students to read or watch. So, without background knowledge, what we need to understand is that our students will struggle to do these things. They will struggle to comprehend, which means that they will struggle if they're being asked to read something independently, or if they're, even if it's a video, it'll be the same thing. Okay, and this has implications for when we ask students to read independently, and we would maybe avoid that happening at the beginning of the unit. They will struggle with focus. It is very difficult for them to take in information if they don't know a lot about the topic, and they will overload their working memory very easily. They will also have difficulty summarizing or analyzing or doing anything at the top end of Bloom's, because again, their working memory will be overloaded and they will struggle to be able to move up Bloom's. Whereas if they know a lot about a topic, they're freeing up their memory and they'll be more able to engage in critical thinking. Okay, so what are the misconceptions that we're holding here, and what are some of the planning mistakes we might be making? The misconception we might be holding is that comprehension skills can be taught. And this is a very common misconception. We see it across all of our classrooms in the way that we teach and structure reading units in primary school and the way that we structure units of work in high school. And the planning mistake is that we might spend a lot of instructional time focusing on reading skills, such as summarizing or inferencing or visualizing, etc. There's a whole list. So, what are our planning principles? Our planning principles are that we teach knowledge before we ask students to apply that knowledge, or what we might call skills. And our second one is that knowledge improves equity. Before we get into that, I do want to make a quick note about comprehension strategies, which are not the same as comprehension skills, and you can do some more research if you want to know the distinction. A few skills like strategies like summarizing or questioning have been shown to be useful when students have a weakness and they maybe are confronted with a text they can't read. It's a bit of a tool, a crutch for students to be able to try and make sense of the text in front of them. However, it's been shown that about 10 hours of instructional time in these, beyond that, there's no effect on learning. And so what that tells us is we should do a short and sharp bout of teaching comprehension strategies at the start of our year and then move on. So coming back to our planning principles, knowledge before skills. Let's see how that might play out in the classroom quickly. So here is an extract from Tomorrow When the War Began. It's a novel about a group of students, young teenagers who went into the bush. While they were there, a war broke out and they need to survive. So in this lesson, students have been expected to have read the novel, which again is already assuming quite a lot of background knowledge, where the students understood what happened in the novel, remember who all the characters are, and remember what has happened in the plot. But putting that aside, in this lesson, students are asked a question such as, in the top right, how does John Marsden show the theme survival within this passage? What is being assumed here is that students understand what survival is and the complex nature of survival. So what we might do when we know that we need to teach knowledge before skills, before we ask them to evaluate, which is a skill, this text, what we might do is we might spend a lot of time allowing students to consolidate and create a schema of meaning around the idea of survival. We might look at the Ukrainian refugees escaping the war as one type of survival from war. We might look at the survivors of the bushfires in Australia, another type of survival that's been caused by a natural disaster, and the different responses of people. Some might respond in this way, some might respond in that way. So students are building up knowledge about this idea of survival before we come and look at the text and try and get them to identify this idea of survival in the text for themselves. If we take a look at a history lesson on the Industrial Revolution, this is an example taken from a student of mine from one of her history lessons in the beginning before she engaged in some professional learning. This was lesson 1, activity 1 on the Industrial Revolution, and the students were asked to watch a 3-minute video on the Industrial Revolution and answer the questions: what is the Industrial Revolution? What happened during the Industrial Revolution? What caused the Industrial Revolution? And what effects did the Industrial Revolution have? That, in effect, is the whole unit of work in the first 5 minutes of this first lesson before the teacher has taught anything. The teacher hasn't taught students what life was like before the Industrial Revolution. What was agriculture? That it was very hands-on. It was very man heavy. That industrial means machinery. It means the creation of machinery and all of those things. So there's no knowledge here for the students to comprehend this video that they've been asked to watch. What we might do instead is we might spend some time talking the students through concepts and explicitly teaching the concepts they need and the knowledge they need about capitalism, about private property ownership, about how you can, in capitalism, in the system, you can accumulate wealth, about agriculture, what that looked like, why, so that they then can understand why machinery would make such a large impact on the people of the time. So that's our first planning principle, about making sure we teach knowledge before we ask students to apply skills. The second relates to knowledge improves equity. So you might have heard of the Matthew effect. Usually it's in the context of wealth, that the rich get richer, and that's because they have an advantage and it's easier to accumulate wealth for them. However, fortunately for us, that same concept applies in knowledge building and in reading. So the more knowledge a student has, the easier it becomes for them to accumulate or acquire more knowledge. And the same thing is for vocabulary. So when we ensure that students consolidate amounts of knowledge, that means that we're snowballing their wealth, their accumulation of knowledge in order for them to be able to accumulate more knowledge, acquire more knowledge on their own and learn independently and so forth and so on. And so in that way, by teaching knowledge and ensuring students have time to consolidate it, we're supporting making the gap between our high achieving students and low achieving students, we're closing that gap. Okay, so those are our 2 planning principles: knowledge before skills, knowledge improves equity. And these relate to Scarborough's reading rope. So now we're going to move on to some misconceptions and planning mistakes and principles around cognitive load theory. So if we remember, cognitive load theory talks about how memory works, the importance of less leading to academic success. We talked about that analogy of if we have too much stuff, it just doesn't fit, and that's kind of the analogy for our working memory. It's limited. We can't stuff too much stuff in there in the lesson or for students because they're just going to have a breakdown in their working memory. However, we do know that long-term memory is unlimited, and so we want students to put knowledge into there, but that takes a lot of time and retrieval practice. So what are our common misconceptions? Common misconceptions that we have is simply that students can engage with a lot of content in a lesson or a unit. And the mistake that we often make is we teach too much. We are all guilty of this. I know this subconsciously, and I still do it even when I'm preparing material for teachers. But what we need to try and remember is we need to try and teach less, teach depth, and teach slowly. So what we want is we want students to understand content at great depths, and we do that through slow teaching and cutting away a lot of our content. So let's go back to that history lesson on the Industrial Revolution, and we remember in the first 5 minutes, students were engaging in this activity, watching the video and answering lots of questions about the Industrial Revolution. Instead, we might change lesson 1 to just have as our learning goals that the students will know when and where the Industrial Revolution occurred, what is agriculture and how was it impacted by the creation of machinery. And we might ask students and check their knowledge at the end by asking them to complete the sentence due to. Thereby they're also learning about sentence structures and practicing their writing at the same time. Another example of trying to teach too much might be in English, and this is a unit outline of an analysis of argument where we look at issues and how people present their arguments on that. As we see here, we have 6 weeks, and over that 6 weeks, students are reading a different topic every week. Some of these topics are extremely complex, like raising the criminal age or addicted to streaming sites, which would require lots and lots of background knowledge for students to understand what the issue is about in and of itself, let alone going deeper and thinking about how different perspectives have been presented and how the author is trying to persuade their reader. So instead, what we might do, if we're cutting it back, we might choose one theme that we're looking at over that entire unit, which might be Indigenous issues. And you can see here in this changed unit of work, we are slowly delving very deeply into the ideas of Indigenous issues. And this means that students will be fascinated and engaged, not through lots and lots of different activities, but they will be fascinated and engaged by the depth and intellectual rigor of the ideas that are being presented to them. So, to finish up, I'd like you to have a short reflection. So I want you to ask, what knowledge have you explicitly taught your students in this current unit of work that you might be looking at? And that doesn't mean where you're asking students to discuss amongst themselves. It doesn't mean where they're watching a video or reading something. It's teacher taught information. And also, are you teaching too much and too quickly? Are you allowing students to have multiple exposures, practice retrieval of this information so that they can draw it up with automaticity? Okay, so we've finished day 2. We've looked at some misconceptions, some planning mistakes, and some ideas for what you might do in the classroom. And I welcome you back tomorrow when we're going to look at a practical implementation model for your students and your classroom. Thank you.